The morning sun cast long shadows across the courtyard of Kensington Palace as Sergeant James Mitchell adjusted his ceremonial uniform for what he thought would be another routine day. At 32, James had served in the Queen's Guard for 8 years, following a distinguished military career that had taken him from the streets of Manchester to the battlefields of Afghanistan. His dedication to duty was unwavering, his record spotless, and his commitment to the royal family absolute. James had always taken pride in the precision of his role. Every movement was calculated, every gesture practiced to perfection. The red tunic, the towering bearskin hat, the polished boots that reflected the morning light. These were not just uniform pieces, but symbols of centuries of tradition. He understood that being a member of the Queen's Guard meant more than standing motionless for hours. It meant being a living embodiment of British heritage and royal protection. The palace grounds were already bustling with activity as staff prepared for the day ahead. James could hear the distant sounds of kitchen workers preparing breakfast, gardeners tending to the immaculate flower beds, and security personnel conducting their morning briefings. This was the rhythm of royal life, a carefully orchestrated symphony where every person knew their part and played it without question. As he took his position outside the main entrance, James reflected on how much his life had changed since joining the Guard. Gone were the days of active combat, replaced by a different kind of service that required equal measures of discipline and restraint. The tourists who gathered daily to catch glimpses of the Guards didn't understand the mental fortitude required to remain perfectly still while cameras flashed and voices chattered around them. Princess Charlotte had always been different from the other royal children James had observed during his service. At 8 years old, she possessed a remarkable combination of intelligence and curiosity that set her apart. Unlike her brothers, who seemed content to follow established routines, Charlotte often questioned why things had to be done in certain ways. James had noticed this during the brief moments when their paths crossed in the palace corridors. The princess had a habit of studying the Guards with genuine interest rather than the casual indifference most royals displayed. James had caught her watching him during several ceremonies, her bright eyes taking in every detail of his uniform and posture. There was something in her expression that suggested she saw beyond the ceremonial facade to the person beneath. On this particular morning, James sensed something unusual in the air. The normal buzz of palace activity seemed more subdued, and he had noticed several staff members engaged in hushed conversations. His training had taught him to be observant of such details, as they often preceded significant events or security concerns. The first indication that something was amiss came when Lady Margaret Thornbury, Princess Charlotte's primary governess, hurried past his position with an expression of barely concealed frustration. Lady Margaret was known for her composure, having served the royal family for over 15 years. To see her visibly agitated was concerning. Minutes later, James observed a heated discussion taking place in the garden between Lady Margaret and Sir Reginald Ashworth, the palace's protocol advisor. Their body language suggested a significant disagreement, though their voices were too low for him to hear specific words. Sir Reginald's gestures were emphatic, while Lady Margaret appeared to be pleading her case with increasing desperation. The conversation ended abruptly when Sir Reginald turned and walked away, leaving Lady Margaret standing alone among the rose bushes. James watched as she composed herself, straightening her shoulders and smoothing her hair before returning to the palace. The brief glimpse of vulnerability he had witnessed told him that whatever was being discussed involved serious consequences. Throughout the morning, James noticed an increase in the number of officials entering and leaving the palace. Several black cars with tinted windows arrived, depositing stern-faced individuals who moved with the purposeful stride of those accustomed to making difficult decisions. The atmosphere grew increasingly tense as these visits continued. It was nearly noon when James first heard Princess Charlotte's voice raised in what was clearly distress. The sound came from an open window on the second floor, and, while he couldn't make out specific words, the tone was unmistakably one of protest and confusion. This was followed by the deeper voices of adults attempting to explain something that the young princess was clearly unwilling to accept. James felt his muscles tense involuntarily. His protective instincts, honed through years of military service, were responding to the obvious distress of a child under his indirect care. Yet his training demanded that he remain motionless, that he trust in the palace hierarchy to handle whatever situation was developing. The voices from the window continued for several more minutes before falling silent. James tried to focus on his duties, scanning the growing crowd of tourists who had gathered to watch the changing of the guard's ceremony scheduled for later that afternoon. Among them, he noticed several individuals whose behavior seemed inconsistent with typical tourist patterns. These individuals, 3 men and 2 women, appeared to be conducting surveillance rather than sightseeing. They moved with military precision, maintained constant communication through discreet earpieces, and positioned themselves at strategic points around the palace perimeter. James made mental notes of their locations and appearances, adding this information to his growing list of unusual occurrences. As the afternoon progressed, James became increasingly aware of Princess Charlotte's absence from her usual activities. Normally, she could be seen in the garden during this time, either reading under her favorite oak tree or playing with her small group of carefully selected companions. Today, the garden remained empty except for the groundskeepers who went about their duties with unusual efficiency. The changing of the guard ceremony proceeded without incident, though James noticed that several senior officers were present who normally wouldn't attend such routine events. Their presence suggested that security concerns had been elevated, though no official announcement had been made to the guards on duty. During the brief transition period when guards were being relieved, James overheard a fragment of conversation between 2 palace security officials. One mentioned something about international implications and no room for compromise, while the other responded with concerns about the child's welfare and unprecedented circumstances. These snippets of information painted a picture of a developing crisis that somehow involved Princess Charlotte. James felt a growing unease as he realized that the young princess might be at the center of whatever diplomatic or political storm was brewing within the palace walls. As evening approached, James was scheduled to take up his final position of the day outside the family quarters. This assignment typically involved monitoring the corridor that led to the royal children's rooms, ensuring their safety during the vulnerable nighttime hours. It was during these quiet evening duties that James had previously observed the normal rhythms of royal family life. Tonight, however, the atmosphere was anything but normal. The corridor was unusually busy with staff members moving purposefully between rooms, their expressions grave and their conversations conducted in whispers. James noticed that several of Princess Charlotte's personal belongings were being moved from her usual room to a different location within the wing. The implications of this change were troubling. In James's experience, such moves typically preceded either significant security threats or major disruptions to normal routines. Either scenario suggested that Princess Charlotte was facing circumstances far beyond the typical challenges of royal childhood. As he took his position for the evening watch, James made a decision that would alter the course of his career and potentially his life. Instead of maintaining his usual passive observation role, he would pay closer attention to the details of whatever was unfolding around Princess Charlotte. His military training had taught him that sometimes the greatest service to duty required looking beyond official orders to the underlying mission of protection. The first few hours of his evening watch passed quietly, but James remained alert to every sound and movement in the corridor. His enhanced attention was rewarded near midnight when he heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching from the direction of Princess Charlotte's new room. Lady Margaret appeared, moving more quietly than James had ever observed her walk. She paused outside the door, pressed her ear against it briefly, then continued down the corridor toward the main staircase. Her behavior suggested she was conducting some form of covert surveillance, which was highly unusual for someone in her official position. James waited until Lady Margaret had disappeared down the stairs before moving silently closer to the door she had been monitoring. What he heard from within the room would fundamentally change his understanding of the situation and set him on a path that would challenge every principle of royal protocol he had sworn to uphold. Through the door, he could hear Princess Charlotte's voice, though she was speaking much more quietly than during her earlier outburst. She appeared to be talking to someone, possibly on a telephone, and her words carried a mixture of fear and determination that no 8-year-old child should have to express. The partial conversation James overheard revealed that Princess Charlotte was being pressured to participate in something she clearly did not want to do. References to meeting the representatives and doing what's expected suggested that diplomatic negotiations were somehow dependent on her compliance with demands she was too young to fully understand. James felt his protective instincts surge as he realized that Princess Charlotte was being placed in an impossible situation. Whatever political or diplomatic crisis was unfolding, it was clear that the adults responsible for her welfare were prioritizing other considerations over her emotional and psychological well-being. The conversation ended abruptly, and James quickly returned to his official position. However, the knowledge he had gained made it impossible for him to continue his duties as though nothing had changed. For the first time in his career, James found himself questioning whether strict adherence to protocol was truly serving the best interests of those he was sworn to protect. As the night continued, James wrestled with the implications of what he had learned. His military training emphasized the importance of following orders and maintaining the chain of command, but his human instincts demanded action to protect a vulnerable child. The conflict between these two imperatives would soon force him to make choices that would test the very foundations of his service to the crown. The following morning brought no relief from the tension that had settled over Kensington Palace like a heavy fog. James arrived for his dawn shift to find the grounds crawling with additional security personnel, their presence impossible to ignore despite efforts to maintain normal appearances. Black SUVs lined the service entrances, and men in dark suits spoke quietly into their communication devices while scanning the perimeter with professional intensity. James took his assigned position with a growing sense of unease. His sleepless night had been filled with fragments of Princess Charlotte's frightened voice and the implications of what he had overheard. The weight of his knowledge felt heavier than his ceremonial rifle as he stood at attention, outwardly composed but internally struggling with questions that had no easy answers. The morning routine proceeded with mechanical precision, but James noticed subtle changes in the behavior of palace staff. Conversations ended abruptly when guards approached, documents were shuffled quickly out of sight, and even the most senior staff members moved with an urgency that betrayed their anxiety. The atmosphere reminded James of pre-mission briefings in Afghanistan, when everyone knew something significant was about to happen, but couldn't discuss it openly. Around 10 o'clock, a convoy of diplomatic vehicles arrived at the main entrance. James watched as flags he didn't immediately recognize fluttered from the lead car's fenders. The occupants who emerged were clearly foreign dignitaries, their formal attire and stern expressions suggesting the gravity of their visit. They were escorted into the palace with the kind of ceremony reserved for the most important international meetings. What troubled James most was the absence of any visible royal family members greeting these important visitors. Typically, diplomatic arrivals of this magnitude involved at least a brief appearance by senior royals, but the delegation was received solely by palace officials and protocol staff. This departure from normal procedures suggested that whatever negotiations were taking place were too sensitive for public observation. As the morning progressed, James found himself paying particular attention to the windows of Princess Charlotte's relocated room. He had memorized its exact position during his night watch and could observe it peripherally without breaking his ceremonial stance. What he saw there deepened his concern considerably. The curtains, which were typically open to let in natural light, remained tightly closed. Occasionally, shadows moved behind the fabric, suggesting that people were present in the room, but there was no sign of Princess Charlotte's usual activities. No books being read by the window, no artwork being created at her small table, no moments of quiet contemplation in her favorite chair. During his brief break period, James made his way to the palace's communication center under the pretext of checking security updates. The duty officer, Corporal Williams, was someone James had served with previously, and their professional relationship allowed for informal conversation during quiet moments. Williams appeared unusually stressed, constantly checking multiple communication channels and responding to frequent calls from palace administrators. When James inquired about the increased security presence, Williams hesitated before explaining that they were dealing with what he termed a delicate diplomatic situation requiring enhanced protective measures. The vague explanation told James nothing he didn't already suspect, but Williams's obvious discomfort suggested that the situation was more complex than routine diplomatic negotiations. When pressed for details, Williams simply shook his head and indicated that information was being shared on a strict need-to-know basis, with most guards kept deliberately uninformed. James returned to his post with a growing sense that Princess Charlotte was at the center of negotiations that could have far-reaching consequences. His military experience had taught him to recognize the signs of crisis management, and everything he observed pointed to a situation where normal protocols had been suspended in favor of emergency procedures. The lunch hour brought a development that confirmed James's worst fears. Lady Margaret emerged from the palace looking haggard and defeated, her usually pristine appearance showing signs of stress and sleepless nights. She was accompanied by a woman James didn't recognize, someone whose bearing and attire suggested medical training. The two women walked quickly toward a side entrance used primarily by service staff, their conversation intense but too distant for James to overhear. However, their body language spoke volumes about their shared concern for whatever was happening inside the palace. Lady Margaret's gestures were animated and pleading, while the other woman's responses appeared calm but firm. When they returned to the palace 20 minutes later, the medical professional carried a small bag of the type used by child psychologists and trauma specialists. James's stomach tightened as he realized that Princess Charlotte's situation had deteriorated to the point where professional mental health intervention was being considered. The afternoon brought another wave of diplomatic visitors, this time including individuals whose appearance suggested they represented different interests than the morning delegation. The tension between these groups was visible even from James's distant position, as protocol officers worked overtime to maintain separation between parties who clearly preferred not to interact directly. James began to piece together the outline of what appeared to be complex international negotiations involving multiple parties with conflicting interests. The fact that these discussions were taking place at Kensington Palace rather than official diplomatic venues suggested that the matter involved the royal family directly, with Princess Charlotte somehow serving as a focal point for the competing demands. His understanding deepened when he observed a heated argument between Sir Reginald Ashworth and a man whose diplomatic credentials marked him as a high-ranking foreign official. Their discussion, conducted in the relative privacy of the garden, was passionate enough to overcome their attempts at discretion. From his position, James could make out references to international law, humanitarian concerns, and unprecedented demands. Sir Reginald's responses included phrases about royal prerogatives, constitutional limitations, and the child's best interests. The foreign officials' counterarguments seemed to focus on treaty obligations, consequences of refusal, and time-sensitive requirements. The argument ended when Sir Reginald abruptly terminated the conversation and returned to the palace, leaving the foreign official standing alone in evident frustration. The diplomat remained in the garden for several minutes, making phone calls that were clearly reporting negative developments to his superiors. As evening approached, James prepared for another night watch that he suspected would be even more revealing than the previous one. However, his assignment was unexpectedly changed at the last minute. Instead of monitoring the corridor outside Princess Charlotte's room, he was reassigned to external perimeter duty. The reassignment was presented as routine rotation, but James recognized it as deliberate. Someone had noticed his increased attention to the princess's situation and decided to remove him from a position where he could observe developments firsthand. This confirmation that his awareness was being monitored only strengthened his resolve to find ways to help Princess Charlotte. During his new assignment, James positioned himself where he could observe the windows of the family quarters from outside the palace. This external vantage point actually provided better visual access to Princess Charlotte's room, though it eliminated his ability to hear conversations in the corridor. What he saw through the window that evening shocked him more than anything he had observed previously. Princess Charlotte was clearly visible, sitting at a small table surrounded by several adults whose postures suggested they were presenting her with documents or materials requiring her attention. The child's body language conveyed obvious distress and resistance. Even at a distance, James could see that Princess Charlotte was shaking her head repeatedly, pushing papers away, and, at one point, covering her face with her hands in a gesture of despair that no child should ever have to make. The adults around her continued their presentations with relentless persistence, apparently unmoved by her obvious emotional distress. The scene continued for over an hour, with Princess Charlotte's resistance gradually weakening under the sustained pressure from the adults. James watched helplessly as the spirited, curious child he had observed in happier times was systematically worn down by demands she was too young to understand or effectively resist. When the meeting finally ended, Princess Charlotte remained seated at the table with her head in her hands while the adults filed out of the room. The image of her small figure, alone and defeated, was seared into James's memory with the intensity of traumatic combat experiences he thought he had left behind. That night, James made a decision that would forever alter his relationship with royal protocol and his understanding of his duty as a protector. He realized that strict adherence to established procedures was allowing harm to come to someone he was sworn to protect, and that his higher obligation was to the welfare of Princess Charlotte rather than to the diplomatic convenience of the adults using her as a negotiating tool. His military training had taught him that there were times when following orders blindly could result in greater harm than taking initiative based on moral imperatives. The situation with Princess Charlotte had reached that critical point where passive compliance with protocol would make him complicit in what he was beginning to recognize as a form of institutional abuse. James spent the remainder of his shift developing a plan that would allow him to gather more detailed information about Princess Charlotte's situation without alerting the palace hierarchy to his intentions. His years of military intelligence work had taught him how to conduct discreet surveillance and gather information through informal networks. The key would be building relationships with other staff members who had access to information about the negotiations while appearing to maintain his normal duties and loyalties. James identified several potential sources, including maintenance workers who had access to all areas of the palace, communications technicians who handled diplomatic calls, and junior staff members who often overheard conversations their superiors assumed they wouldn't understand. His first target would be Mrs. Sarah Collins, a senior housekeeper who had worked in the family quarters for over 20 years. Mrs. Collins was known for her discretion and her genuine affection for the royal children. If anyone would be willing to share concerns about Princess Charlotte's welfare, it would be someone like her. James also planned to cultivate a relationship with Thomas Wright, a communications technician whose work required him to maintain equipment throughout the palace. Thomas's access to technical systems might provide insights into the diplomatic communications that were driving the current crisis. As dawn approached and his shift ended, James felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since his military service. The mission ahead was dangerous and could end his career, but the alternative, allowing Princess Charlotte to continue suffering without intervention, was unthinkable. Walking away from the palace that morning, James carried with him the weight of knowledge that would soon force him to choose between his oath of loyalty to the crown and his moral obligation to protect an innocent child from harm. The choice, he realized, had already been made. The only question now was how effectively he could act on it without destroying his ability to help Princess Charlotte when she needed it most. James arrived at the palace the next morning with renewed determination and a carefully crafted plan to gather more information about Princess Charlotte's situation. His military training had taught him that successful intelligence gathering required patience, subtlety, and the ability to appear completely normal while conducting sensitive operations. His first opportunity came during the morning break when he encountered Mrs. Sarah Collins in the staff corridor. The veteran housekeeper appeared more troubled than James had ever seen her, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by obvious worry lines and tired eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. James approached the conversation carefully, beginning with routine inquiries about her family and expressing concern about her apparent fatigue. Mrs. Collins initially maintained professional discretion, but her genuine distress about Princess Charlotte's situation eventually overcame her training to remain silent about palace affairs. Mrs. Collins revealed that she had been responsible for preparing Princess Charlotte's new room and had witnessed several disturbing interactions between the child and various officials. According to her observations, Princess Charlotte had been subjected to hours of what could only be described as psychological pressure, with teams of adults taking turns presenting her with documents and explanations she was too young to comprehend. The housekeeper's voice trembled as she described finding Princess Charlotte crying alone in her room multiple times, surrounded by papers covered with official seals and foreign language text. The child had apparently been told that her cooperation with unspecified demands was essential for preventing serious consequences for her family and country. Mrs. Collins also shared her concern about Princess Charlotte's deteriorating physical condition. The child had been eating very little, sleeping poorly, and showing signs of stress that were alarming for someone her age. Despite repeated requests for medical evaluation, palace officials had insisted that the situation was temporary and that outside intervention was unnecessary. James listened with growing anger as Mrs. Collins described attempts by Lady Margaret and other staff members to advocate for Princess Charlotte's welfare, only to be overruled by senior officials who insisted that diplomatic considerations took precedence over the child's immediate comfort. The clear message was that Princess Charlotte's individual needs were secondary to whatever international crisis required her involvement. The conversation was interrupted when Sir Reginald Ashworth appeared in the corridor, his presence immediately causing Mrs. Collins to fall silent and hurry away. Sir Reginald observed James with obvious suspicion, asking pointed questions about his duties and whether he had any concerns about palace security. James maintained his professional demeanor while being questioned, but He could sense that Sir Reginald was conducting a form of investigation into staff loyalty and discretion. The protocol advisor's questions suggested that palace leadership was aware of growing unrest among staff members and was taking steps to identify potential sources of information leaks. After Sir Reginald departed, James realized that his information-gathering activities would need to become more sophisticated to avoid detection. He spent the rest of his shift observing the patterns of palace operations, identifying times and locations where he could conduct discreet conversations without arousing suspicion from senior officials. His opportunity came that afternoon when he was assigned to escort Thomas Wright, the communications technician, during a routine maintenance check of security equipment. Thomas proved to be a valuable source of information, though his revelations were even more disturbing than Mrs. Collins's observations. Thomas explained that he had been required to install additional secure communication equipment to handle the increased diplomatic traffic related to Princess Charlotte's situation. His work had given him access to fragments of conversations that painted a clear picture of international negotiations using the princess as a central bargaining element. According to Thomas, the crisis involved a complex dispute between multiple countries over trade agreements, territorial claims, and resource rights. Princess Charlotte had somehow become symbolically important to one or more of these disputes, with foreign powers demanding her personal participation in ceremonies or agreements that would legitimize their positions. The technical details of the communications equipment revealed that discussions were taking place with representatives from at least 4 different countries, each with conflicting demands regarding Princess Charlotte's involvement. The British government appeared to be caught between competing pressures, with some officials arguing for compliance to avoid economic or political consequences, while others insisted that involving a child in such negotiations was morally unacceptable. Thomas also revealed that secure video conferences had been scheduled for the following day, during which Princess Charlotte would be expected to appear before foreign representatives and provide some form of consent or agreement to terms she couldn't possibly understand. The child was being coached on specific words to say and gestures to make, regardless of her comprehension of their significance. This information crystallized James's understanding of the impossible situation facing Princess Charlotte. She was being used as a political tool by adults who prioritized international relations over her welfare, forced to participate in negotiations that would have serious consequences regardless of her level of understanding or consent. That evening, James made his most dangerous decision yet. Instead of maintaining his assigned position, he used his knowledge of palace security systems to access areas where he could observe Princess Charlotte's preparation sessions for the next day's conferences. What he witnessed there removed any remaining doubt about the necessity of intervention. Princess Charlotte was seated at a table facing 3 adults who were drilling her on responses to questions she would be asked during the video conferences. The child was clearly exhausted and confused, repeatedly asking for explanations that were dismissed as unnecessary. When she made mistakes in her rehearsed responses, the adults showed obvious frustration and insisted she repeat the sequences until they were memorized perfectly. James watched as Princess Charlotte broke down crying during one particularly intensive coaching session, begging to speak with her parents and asking why she had to say words she didn't understand to people she had never met. The adults' responses were cold and focused solely on the importance of her cooperation for reasons that remained deliberately vague. The coaching continued for over 2 hours, with Princess Charlotte's resistance gradually weakening under the relentless pressure. By the end of the session, she was mechanically repeating the required phrases with the defeated compliance of someone who had learned that resistance was futile. The transformation from the spirited child James had previously observed to this broken, compliant figure was devastating to witness. After the session ended and Princess Charlotte was left alone, James made a decision that would violate every protocol governing his position, but align with his deeper understanding of his duty to protect. He waited until the corridor was clear, then approached Princess Charlotte's room and knocked softly on the door. Princess Charlotte's voice from within was small and frightened as she asked who was there. James identified himself as one of the guards and asked if she was all right. The conversation that followed, though brief, provided confirmation of everything James suspected about her situation. Princess Charlotte explained, in the simple language of a frightened 8-year-old, that she was being forced to participate in important meetings with people from other countries who wanted her to agree to things she didn't understand. She had been told that refusing to cooperate would cause serious problems for her family and Britain, but no one would explain what the meetings were really about or why her participation was so important. The child's confusion and fear were heartbreaking, but what disturbed James most was her acceptance of the situation as something she had no power to change. Princess Charlotte had been systematically conditioned to believe that her cooperation was mandatory, regardless of her personal feelings or understanding of the consequences. James provided what comfort he could during their brief conversation, assuring Princess Charlotte that adults who cared about her welfare were aware of her situation and working to help her. He couldn't provide specific details about any rescue plans, since none existed yet, but he wanted her to know that she was not completely alone. The conversation ended when James heard footsteps approaching in the corridor. He quickly returned to his position, but not before Princess Charlotte whispered a request that would haunt him for days afterward. She asked if he could help her understand why the adults were making her do things that felt wrong, and whether there was any way to make the meeting stop. James's inability to provide satisfactory answers to these questions reinforced his conviction that Princess Charlotte's situation required intervention that went beyond official channels. The palace hierarchy had clearly prioritized diplomatic considerations over the child's welfare, making it necessary for someone outside that system to advocate for her interests. That night, James began developing a more comprehensive plan for helping Princess Charlotte. His military experience had taught him that successful operations required clear objectives, detailed planning, and contingency preparations for multiple scenarios. The mission ahead would require all of these elements if it was to succeed, without making Princess Charlotte's situation worse. His first priority was establishing secure communication with individuals outside the palace who might be able to provide assistance or advocacy for Princess Charlotte's rights. This would require careful research to identify appropriate contacts and discreet methods for reaching them without alerting palace security systems. James also recognized the need for documented evidence of Princess Charlotte's treatment and the nature of the demands being placed on her. His observations alone would not be sufficient to convince outside authorities that intervention was necessary, particularly given his relatively junior position in the palace hierarchy. The plan would also require careful timing to ensure that any intervention occurred before Princess Charlotte's forced participation in the scheduled diplomatic conferences. Once she had been compelled to provide consent or agreement to unknown terms, the damage to her psychological welfare and the legitimacy of any agreements might be irreversible. As James concluded his shift and prepared to leave the palace, he carried with him the weight of Princess Charlotte's trust and the knowledge that he was possibly her only hope for escaping a situation that was becoming more psychologically damaging with each passing day. The path ahead was dangerous and uncertain, but his commitment to protecting her had become stronger than his fear of the consequences. The next phase of his plan would require resources and contacts he didn't currently possess, but James's military training had taught him that seemingly impossible missions could succeed when driven by moral necessity and careful preparation. Princess Charlotte's welfare had become his primary mission, and he was determined to see it through regardless of the personal cost. The morning of the scheduled diplomatic video conferences arrived with an atmosphere of barely controlled tension throughout Kensington Palace. James arrived for his shift to find the grounds surrounded by additional security measures that had been implemented overnight, including mobile communications jamming equipment and expanded perimeter patrols that suggested the palace was preparing for potential media attention or other forms of outside interference. James's modified plan had crystallized during his sleepless night into a strategy that balanced immediate action with longer-term advocacy for Princess Charlotte's welfare. His military training had taught him that the most successful operations often combined multiple approaches, creating redundant pathways to success while minimizing the risk of complete failure. His first objective was to document Princess Charlotte's treatment in a way that would provide irrefutable evidence of the inappropriate pressure being placed on her. James had identified several opportunities during his normal duties to discreetly record audio and visual evidence using the small recording device he had acquired during his previous intelligence work. The challenge was gathering this evidence without alerting palace security systems or arousing suspicion from the senior officials who were clearly monitoring staff behavior for signs of disloyalty. James's solution involved using his legitimate security duties as cover for positioning himself near locations where Princess Charlotte's coaching sessions and conference preparations were taking place. His first success came during the morning preparation session, when he was assigned to conduct a routine security check of the conference room being prepared for Princess Charlotte's video appearances. The room had been equipped with sophisticated telecommunications equipment and formal seating arrangements designed to create an official atmosphere for the diplomatic exchanges. While conducting his security inspection, James was able to observe the final rehearsal session between Princess Charlotte and her handlers. The child appeared even more distressed than during previous sessions, her exhaustion evident in her posture and response times. The adults around her showed no apparent concern for her obvious suffering, focusing solely on perfecting her scripted responses to anticipated questions. James positioned his recording device to capture both audio and visual elements of the rehearsal, documenting the systematic psychological pressure being applied to force Princess Charlotte's compliance with demands she clearly didn't understand. The evidence showed adults using manipulation tactics that would be considered inappropriate for any child, regardless of their social position or the supposed importance of their cooperation. The rehearsal revealed specific details about the nature of the agreements Princess Charlotte was being forced to endorse. The foreign representatives would be asking her to provide personal consent to trade agreements that involved British territories and resources, using her symbolic status as a royal child to legitimize claims that were politically controversial. Princess Charlotte was being coached to express enthusiasm for these agreements and to state that she understood their importance for maintaining peaceful relationships between countries. The scripted responses included phrases about her willingness to support international cooperation and her understanding of the responsibilities that came with her royal heritage. What made the situation even more disturbing was the clear evidence that Princess Charlotte had no comprehension of the real meaning behind the words she was being forced to memorize. When she asked questions about specific terms or concepts, her handlers provided vague explanations that avoided any meaningful discussion of the agreement's implications or consequences. James's recording captured Princess Charlotte asking, with heartbreaking innocence, whether agreeing to help other countries meant she would have to leave her family or give up her toys and books. The adults' responses dismissed these concerns as irrelevant while insisting that her cooperation was essential for reasons she was too young to understand. After completing the security check, James moved to his assigned position for monitoring the actual video conferences, which were scheduled to begin within the hour. His location provided limited visual access to the conference room, but he was able to establish audio surveillance that would document Princess Charlotte's forced participation in the diplomatic negotiations. The first conference began promptly at noon, with Princess Charlotte seated at the head of an imposing table surrounded by British officials and facing a large screen displaying foreign representatives. Even from his distant position, James could see the child's nervousness and the way she clutched a small stuffed animal that had been allowed as her only source of comfort during the proceedings. The audio surveillance revealed the systematic exploitation of Princess Charlotte's innocence for political purposes. Foreign representatives asked her questions that were designed to elicit specific responses that would support their negotiating positions, while British officials prompted her with subtle cues to ensure she provided the desired answers. Princess Charlotte's voice was small and uncertain as she recited her memorized responses, occasionally asking for clarification about questions she didn't understand. These moments of confusion were quickly managed by the British officials, who provided leading prompts that guided her back to the scripted responses without addressing her actual concerns. James documented over 2 hours of this psychological manipulation, gathering evidence that clearly demonstrated Princess Charlotte was being used as a propaganda tool in negotiations that had serious implications for British international relations. The child's obvious distress and confusion provided stark contrast to the formal diplomatic language being used to describe her enthusiastic cooperation. During a break between conferences, James observed Lady Margaret attempting to provide Princess Charlotte with emotional support, only to be curtly dismissed by Sir Reginald Ashworth. The interaction revealed the internal conflict within palace staff between those who prioritized Princess Charlotte's welfare and those who focused solely on the diplomatic objectives of the negotiations. The second conference was even more difficult to watch, as Princess Charlotte's exhaustion became increasingly evident in her slowed responses and obvious confusion about the questions being asked. The foreign representatives showed no consideration for her age or emotional state, pressing forward with their agenda despite clear signs that the child was reaching her limits of endurance. James's audio recordings captured Princess Charlotte asking, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether she could please stop answering questions because her head hurt and she wanted to see her mother. The request was denied by Sir Reginald, who reminded her of the importance of completing all scheduled meetings and fulfilling her responsibilities to the country. The foreign representatives responded to Princess Charlotte's visible distress by accelerating their questioning, apparently concerned that further delays might compromise their ability to obtain the agreements they sought. Their lack of consideration for her welfare provided additional evidence of the inappropriate nature of the entire negotiation process. As the conferences continued, James realized that his documentation efforts, while important for future advocacy, were not providing immediate relief for Princess Charlotte's suffering. The child was being systematically traumatized by adults who viewed her as a political asset rather than a vulnerable human being who deserved protection and care. This realization prompted James to implement the second phase of his plan, which involved reaching out to external contacts who might be able to intervene on Princess Charlotte's behalf. His military service had provided him with connections to human rights organizations, child advocacy groups, and investigative journalists who specialized in exposing institutional abuse. Using secure communication methods he had learned during intelligence operations, James began transmitting his documented evidence to contacts outside the palace hierarchy. His strategy was to create multiple pressure points that would force public attention to Princess Charlotte's situation while making it difficult for palace officials to suppress the information or retaliate against individual sources. His first contact was Sarah Brennan, an investigative journalist who had previously exposed institutional failures in child protection services. Sarah's reputation for thorough research and her connections to international human rights organizations made her an ideal advocate for bringing Princess Charlotte's situation to public attention. James provided Sarah with selected portions of his audio and visual documentation, along with detailed background information about the diplomatic negotiations and the systematic pressure being applied to force Princess Charlotte's cooperation. The evidence clearly demonstrated that a young child was being subjected to psychological manipulation that would be considered abusive in any other context. Sarah's initial response confirmed James's assessment that Princess Charlotte's treatment represented a serious violation of child protection principles that transcended diplomatic immunity and royal protocol. She committed to conducting additional research and developing a comprehensive exposé that would force public accountability for the adults responsible for the child's treatment. James also contacted Dr. Michael Thompson, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery and had extensive experience testifying about institutional abuse cases. Dr. Thompson's review of the documented evidence confirmed that Princess Charlotte was experiencing systematic psychological trauma that could have lasting effects on her emotional development and mental health. The psychological evaluation provided professional validation for James's concerns about Princess Charlotte's welfare while establishing the basis for potential legal action to protect her interests. Dr. Thompson agreed to prepare a formal assessment that could be used to support intervention efforts and hold responsible parties accountable for their actions. As the day progressed and more video conferences were scheduled, James continued his documentation efforts while monitoring the external contacts he had established. The response from child advocacy organizations was immediate and intense, with multiple groups expressing outrage about Princess Charlotte's treatment and demanding immediate intervention to protect her welfare. The growing external pressure created new risks for James's position within the palace hierarchy, as senior officials began investigating potential sources of information leaks. However, his military training had taught him that successful operations often required accepting personal risks to achieve mission objectives, and protecting Princess Charlotte had become his primary mission. By evening, James had established a network of external advocates who were prepared to take action on Princess Charlotte's behalf, while continuing to document the ongoing psychological manipulation she was being forced to endure. The foundation had been laid for a comprehensive challenge to the palace's treatment of the child, but the immediate question remained whether intervention would occur before Princess Charlotte suffered irreversible psychological damage. The next phase would require even greater risks and more direct action, as James realized that external pressure alone might not be sufficient to protect Princess Charlotte from the immediate harm being caused by the continuing diplomatic negotiations. His commitment to her welfare had evolved beyond documentation and advocacy to a determination to take whatever action was necessary to end her suffering, regardless of the consequences to his own career and security. The crisis reached its breaking point on the third day of diplomatic negotiations when James arrived at the palace to find Princess Charlotte in a state of complete emotional collapse. The intensive coaching sessions and forced participation in video conferences had pushed the 8-year-old beyond her psychological limits, resulting in what palace medical staff were quietly describing as a nervous breakdown. James learned about Princess Charlotte's condition through Mrs. Collins, who had been one of the first staff members to discover the child in her room that morning. According to her account, Princess Charlotte had been found curled in a corner, unresponsive to questions, and showing signs of severe psychological trauma that required immediate medical attention. The palace's response to Princess Charlotte's breakdown revealed the depth of their commitment to prioritizing diplomatic objectives over child welfare. Instead of canceling the remaining conferences and providing appropriate medical care, senior officials were consulting with medical professionals about ways to stabilize Princess Charlotte's condition sufficiently to allow the negotiations to continue. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a child psychiatrist who had been brought in to assess Princess Charlotte's condition, was reportedly horrified by the systematic psychological abuse the child had endured. Her preliminary evaluation indicated that Princess Charlotte was suffering from acute stress disorder and required immediate removal from the traumatic environment that had caused her breakdown. However, Dr. Warren's medical recommendations were being overruled by palace officials who insisted that international commitments took precedence over individual health concerns. The psychiatrist's protests about the potential for permanent psychological damage were dismissed as excessive caution that failed to consider the broader implications of diplomatic failure. James realized that the external pressure he had generated through his contacts was not developing quickly enough to prevent further harm to Princess Charlotte. The child's psychological collapse demonstrated that immediate intervention was necessary to protect her from additional trauma, even if such action required violating fundamental protocols governing royal security. His decision to take direct action was crystallized when he learned that Sir Reginald Ashworth had ordered preparations for additional video conferences to be held that afternoon, despite Princess Charlotte's obvious inability to participate in further negotiations. The plan involved using sedative medications to manage her anxiety while forcing her to complete the remaining diplomatic requirements. The prospect of Princess Charlotte being drugged into compliance with demands she couldn't understand represented a level of abuse that James could not tolerate, regardless of the consequences for his own position. His military oath had taught him that some situations required individual action when institutional systems failed to protect the innocent, and Princess Charlotte's situation had clearly reached that threshold. James spent his lunch break finalizing a plan that would remove Princess Charlotte from the palace and transport her to a secure location where she could receive appropriate medical care while external advocates worked to expose the systematic abuse she had endured. The plan required precise timing and the cooperation of several trusted colleagues who shared his concerns about the child's welfare. His first ally was Thomas Wright, the communications technician who had provided valuable intelligence about the diplomatic negotiations. Thomas had become increasingly disturbed by the evidence of Princess Charlotte's psychological manipulation and was willing to use his access to security systems to support a rescue operation. Mrs. Collins also agreed to assist, though her role would be limited to providing access to Princess Charlotte's location and ensuring that the child was prepared for emergency transport. Her maternal instincts had been outraged by Princess Charlotte's treatment, and she was determined to help protect the child from further abuse. The plan involved creating a temporary disruption of palace security systems that would provide a window of opportunity for removing Princess Charlotte without triggering immediate alarms. Thomas would disable specific surveillance cameras and communication links while James used his security credentials to access restricted areas without arousing suspicion. Mrs. Collins would retrieve Princess Charlotte from her room under the pretext of taking her for medical evaluation, then meet James at a predetermined location where the actual extraction would take place. The timing was critical, as the window between security disruption and discovery would be measured in minutes rather than hours. James had arranged for Princess Charlotte to be taken to a private medical facility where Dr. Thompson, the child psychologist he had contacted earlier, would provide immediate evaluation and care. The facility's security and confidentiality protocols would protect Princess Charlotte from palace efforts to retrieve her, while legal and media pressure mounted for a permanent solution to her situation. The operation began at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, during a shift change that provided natural cover for the unusual movement of personnel. Thomas initiated the security disruptions on schedule, creating blind spots in the surveillance system without triggering immediate alerts from the central monitoring station. James moved through the palace corridors with the confidence of someone conducting routine security duties, his familiar presence allowing him to reach the family quarters without questioning from other staff members. His military training helped him maintain calm despite the enormous risks associated with what was essentially a kidnapping operation, albeit one motivated by protective rather than harmful intentions. Mrs. Collins executed her part of the plan flawlessly, approaching Princess Charlotte's room with the quiet efficiency of someone performing normal duties. She found the child in a state of severe emotional distress, barely responsive to gentle encouragement, but willing to follow someone she trusted to what she was told would be a safe place away from the frightening meetings. The extraction itself proceeded without immediate complications, as James was able to transport Princess Charlotte through service corridors and a maintenance exit that provided access to the vehicle he had arranged for the operation. The child was too exhausted and confused to fully understand what was happening, but she seemed to sense that she was being taken away from the source of her trauma. Dr. Thompson met them at the medical facility and immediately began an emergency evaluation of Princess Charlotte's psychological condition. His preliminary assessment confirmed the severity of the trauma she had experienced while providing documentation that would support legal action against those responsible for her abuse. Within hours of Princess Charlotte's removal from the palace, the story broke simultaneously across multiple media outlets, with James's documented evidence providing irrefutable proof of the systematic psychological abuse she had endured. The international response was immediate and intense, with child protection organizations, government officials, and media commentators expressing outrage about the treatment of an 8-year-old child for diplomatic purposes. The palace's initial response was to claim that Princess Charlotte had been taken by unauthorized individuals and to demand her immediate return. However, the release of audio and video evidence showing her forced participation in negotiations she couldn't understand quickly undermined any claims that her treatment had been appropriate or voluntary. Sir Reginald Ashworth and other senior officials found themselves facing intense scrutiny as details emerged about their roles in forcing Princess Charlotte to participate in negotiations that clearly violated basic principles of child protection. The international diplomatic agreements they had sought to secure through her participation were immediately called into question by the revelation of the abusive methods used to obtain her consent. James faced immediate suspension and arrest on charges related to kidnapping and violation of royal security protocols. However, the overwhelming public support for his actions and the clear evidence that he had acted to protect a child from systematic abuse created significant pressure for lenient treatment of his case. The legal proceedings that followed established important precedents regarding the limits of diplomatic immunity when child welfare was at stake. Princess Charlotte's case became a landmark in international law, demonstrating that no political objective could justify the psychological abuse of children, regardless of their social position or symbolic importance. Dr. Thompson's ongoing treatment of Princess Charlotte revealed the extent of the psychological damage caused by her forced participation in the diplomatic negotiations. The child required months of intensive therapy to overcome the trauma she had experienced, but her recovery was aided by the knowledge that her suffering had been acknowledged and that steps were being taken to prevent similar abuse of other children. James's career in the Queen's Guard ended with his dismissal from service, but his actions were ultimately vindicated by official investigations that confirmed the inappropriate treatment Princess Charlotte had received. His decision to prioritize child protection over institutional loyalty became a case study in ethical decision-making under extreme circumstances. The diplomatic crisis that had led to Princess Charlotte's abuse was ultimately resolved through conventional negotiations that did not require the participation of royal children. The international agreements that had seemed so crucial during the initial crisis proved to be achievable through normal diplomatic channels once the inappropriate pressure tactics were abandoned. Princess Charlotte's recovery was gradual but complete, aided by therapy that helped her understand that the adult's actions had been wrong and that she bore no responsibility for the trauma she had experienced. Her resilience and the support of caring adults who prioritized her welfare over political considerations enabled her to overcome the psychological damage and return to normal childhood development. The case established new protocols for royal security that specifically addressed child protection concerns, ensuring that future diplomatic negotiations could not involve the participation of minors in ways that compromised their psychological welfare. James's actions had not only saved Princess Charlotte from further trauma but had also created systemic changes that would protect other royal children from similar abuse. Years later, Princess Charlotte would remember James as the guard who listened to her fears and took action to protect her when the adults responsible for her care had failed in their duty. His willingness to sacrifice his career for her welfare became a defining example of moral courage that transcended institutional loyalty and demonstrated the fundamental importance of protecting children from harm, regardless of the political costs involved.